The morning Louise Rhodes walked away from everything she had ever been promised. The sky above Cincinnati was the color of old pewter, and the lawyer's ink was still wet on the paper she refused to sign. It had started 3 weeks before that gray morning, in the parlor of her late father's house on Vine Street, a house that smelled of cedar and pipe tobacco, and the particular sadness of a place where someone important had recently died. Franklin Rhodes had been a good man, a surveyor by trade, and he had left behind two things worth arguing over: a parcel of land in the New Mexico territory and a daughter who had inherited every stubborn inch of his character. Louise was 24 years old, dark-haired, brown-eyed, with hands that were stronger than her relatives thought appropriate for a woman of her station, and a heart that had already quietly decided what it wanted before her brain had finished working through the details. Her uncle, Gerald Rhodes, had arrived from Philadelphia within 48 hours of the funeral, with a man named Hargrove in tow. Hargrove was a lawyer with a pointed beard and a soft, practiced voice, and together the two of them had laid out what they called an arrangement. Gerald would take possession of the New Mexico land, which had been registered in Franklin's name but which Gerald claimed was owed to him through an old partnership debt. All Louise had to do was sign a release document. In exchange, Gerald would ensure that she was placed in a comfortable boarding house in Boston, would receive a modest monthly allowance, and would be introduced to several eligible gentlemen of means. A soft life, Gerald said, folding his hands across his substantial belly. A proper life. A life that suits a woman alone in the world. Louise had looked at the paper for a long time. She had read every line of it twice, then a third time, and then she had set it back on the mahogany table and looked her uncle in the eye and said, very clearly, no. Gerald had blustered. Hargrove had produced a second version of the document with slightly different language. Gerald had reminded her that she had no practical skills, no husband, no brothers, no living parents, and no understanding whatsoever of what it took to survive in the Western Territories. He had told her the land was worthless anyway, a dry, rocky piece of scrubland that her father had acquired on a fool's whim during a surveying expedition in 1876. He had told her she would be dead within a season. He had told her she was being emotional, irrational, and embarrassing. Louise had thanked him for his concern, walked upstairs, packed a single trunk and a saddlebag, and spent the next 12 days quietly converting the small amount of cash her father had left her in a separate private account into travel money, supplies, and a good rifle she bought from a shop on 4th Street whose owner asked no questions. She had also sent a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, a letter in which she explained who she was, that she was Franklin Rhodes's only heir, and that she intended to come and see about her father's land in person. She had not told Gerald any of this. On the morning she left, she had simply gone. The train journey from Cincinnati to Kansas City took 3 days. From Kansas City, she booked passage on a westbound stage to Dodge City, which was a miserable 2-day experience that left her with a bruised shoulder and a thorough education in the particular agonies of travel across the open plains. In Dodge City, in the spring of 1879, she bought herself a horse, a stout bay mare with a white blaze and a sensible disposition, and she named the mare Clara after a schoolteacher she had once admired. She also restocked her supplies, cleaned and oiled her rifle, and asked the man at the livery stable which road would take her south toward New Mexico. He had looked at her the way nearly every man she had encountered on this journey had looked at her, which was a look that combined surprise with a sort of worried pity, as if she were a very small child who had announced she intended to climb a mountain. She had thanked him and ridden south anyway. The country between Dodge City and the New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1879 was vast and indifferent and breathtakingly beautiful, in a way that Louise had not fully expected. She had grown up in Ohio, where the land was green and settled and divided into neat parcels by fence posts and stone walls, and where the horizon was always interrupted by a barn or a church steeple or a line of elm trees. Out here, the horizon was the horizon, pure and unobstructed, and so far away that the sky seemed to have weight to it. She rode through country that smelled of sage and dry earth, and something sweet she could not identify, through land where the grass was short and pale gold, and moved in long waves when the wind came through. She crossed rivers that were barely rivers, brown trickles of water in wide sandy beds, and she passed through small towns that were more idea than reality, collections of false-fronted buildings standing in the dust with a determined air of permanence. She was 5 days out of Dodge City, somewhere in the southern reaches of Kansas close to the Indian Territory border, when the trouble found her. It was not dramatic trouble, not at first. She had made camp near a creek bed, a thin line of cottonwood trees that offered shade and the faint comfort of running water, and she had just finished eating a modest supper of beans and salt pork when she heard horses on the road above her camp. 3 men riding slowly. She did not move. She had learned in the past week that a lone woman on the trail attracted exactly the kind of attention she did not want, and so she sat very still and watched the riders through the screen of the cottonwood branches and hoped they would pass. They did not pass. One of them, a heavy-set man with a red beard, spotted the glow of her small fire and turned his horse toward it without hesitation. And then there were 3 men sitting their horses at the edge of her camp, looking down at her with expressions that made her hand move carefully toward the rifle lying across her saddlebag. She had not quite reached it when a 4th rider came down the slope from the road, moving fast and without ceremony, and the 4th rider was different from the other 3 in several important ways, the most immediately relevant of which was that he wore a badge. He was wearing a tan canvas duster and a dark hat, and he was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, with a lean, angular face that had been burned brown by a great deal of outdoor living, and dark eyes that moved quickly and professionally over the situation in front of him. He did not appear to be surprised by any of it. He pulled his horse to a stop between Louise and the 3 riders and said, in a voice that was quiet but carried absolutely clearly, that these gentlemen were going to continue on down the road, and he said it in the way that certain people say certain things, which is to say that it was not a suggestion. The heavy-set man with the red beard looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the badge. Then he turned his horse and rode away, and his 2 companions followed him without a word. The man with the badge turned to Louise. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, assessing eyes, and then he said, "You all right, ma'am?" "Yes," Louise said, and she was proud of how steady her voice was. "Thank you." He swung down from his horse in a single fluid motion and crouched to look at the fire, not at her, which she found oddly considerate. "You're alone out here. That is fairly evident." "Yes, ma'am, it is." He glanced up at her then, and there was something in the corner of his expression that might have been amusement if it had been given more room to develop. "Where are you headed?" "New Mexico Territory." "A place called Cimarron or near it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good stretch of riding still." "I am aware." He stood back up and turned to his horse, and she thought he was going to simply ride off, which would have been the rational thing for him to do. Instead he said, "I'm Marshall McCrae. I ride out of the Territorial Marshal's office in Wichita, but I've been working south lately. I'm heading toward the New Mexico line myself. Not all the way to Cimarron, but close enough." He looked at her with a directness that was not rude but was very frank. "They're safer traveling in company. That's all I'm saying." Louise Rhodes looked at Marshall McCrae for a moment and decided several things about him quickly, the way she had always done with people, a habit her mother had called reading and her uncle had called presumption. She decided he was honest. She decided he was competent. She decided he was not the kind of man who made offers he did not mean, and she decided that traveling alone in this country was, in fact, considerably more dangerous than she had entirely wanted to admit to herself. "All right," she said, "but I will be cooking my own meals and maintaining my own camp." "Wouldn't have it any other way," he said, and this time the amusement did reach his expression, just briefly, before it went away again. His name, she learned in the days that followed, was Marshall McCrae in full, and he had been born in Missouri in 1850, making him 29 to her 24, a difference that seemed unremarkable when measured against the much larger difference of their experiences with the world they were currently riding through. He had been a deputy in 3 different counties before taking on the marshal's circuit work, and he knew this country the way she knew the streets of Cincinnati, which was to say by instinct and accumulated small knowledge, by the way the light fell at certain hours and the way the wind shifted before weather came, by landmarks that had no names on any map. He did not talk very much, which Louise initially found uncomfortable and then found she appreciated. When he did talk, it was worth hearing. He told her which water sources on their route were reliable and which were seasonal and currently dry. He told her about the politics of the territory, the land disputes and the range wars, and the complicated web of competing interests that made law enforcement out here a study in patience and improvisation, rather than the application of clear statutes. He told her, with a careful neutrality that she respected, about the situation with the various indigenous peoples of the region, the Comanche and the Kiowa who had been pushed onto reservation land by treaties that were honored inconsistently, the Apache bands who still moved through the territory with a freedom that the Army was actively working to eliminate, and the long history of injustice beneath all of it that sat like bedrock under everything else. "It's a hard thing," he said one evening when they were camped on the open plain with a spectacular sunset burning itself out to the west, to look at this land and know that every deed and every claim to it started with someone being removed from it. Louise had been looking at the sunset. She looked at him instead. "You think about that. It would be a poor kind of man that didn't," he said. She liked him for that. She was surprised by how much she liked him for that. They traveled through country that changed as they moved south, the flat grasslands giving way to broken terrain, low red hills and dry arroyos, and the occasional dramatic rise of a mesa standing against the sky like a declaration. They passed through small settlements and crossed several significant rivers, and once, in a moment that Louise would think about for years afterward, they came over a rise and saw a herd of pronghorn antelope moving across the valley below them. Hundreds of them, their tan and white bodies catching the morning light, and both she and Marshall had stopped their horses simultaneously and watched without speaking until the animals had passed out of sight. He had looked at her afterward and she had looked at him, and neither of them had said anything about it, but something had passed between them in the silence that was, she suspected, more significant than a great deal of conversation. She learned more about him in fragments, the way you learn about country when you are riding through it, by what you can observe directly and what you can infer from what is there and what is conspicuously absent. He had been married once briefly, and his wife had died of a fever in the winter of 1874 in a town in Kansas that he named but once and did not return to. He had no family left to speak of. He had been moving through the territory for 5 years on his circuit work, and he was good at it, genuinely good at it, not because he was particularly fast with a gun, though she suspected he was that too, but because he understood people with a kind of patient intelligence that made negotiation possible where other men would have defaulted to confrontation. She told him about herself in return, because it seemed only fair. She told him about her father, about the surveys and the journeys west, and the stories that had come back with Franklin Rhodes from the territories, and had sat in her imagination her whole childhood like seeds waiting for water. She told him about the land, what little she knew of it, 700 acres in the Cimarron River Valley that her father had described in his letters as raw but promising, with good water and grass enough for cattle if a person had the patience and the work ethic to build something there. She told him about her uncle and the document and the offer of a soft life in Boston. Marshall had listened to all of it without interrupting, which she also appreciated because most people, when given the shape of a problem, immediately began offering solutions, When she finished, he said, "Your father surveyed that land himself." He did. In the summer of 1876, he filed the claim in Santa Fe. "Then it's yours," Marshall said, with a simple finality that she found enormously steadying. "Whatever your uncle says, the law is fairly clear on inheritance of recorded land claims. My uncle has a lawyer. So do land offices," Marshall said, "and so does the territorial marshal's jurisdiction." He looked at her steadily. "I know people in Santa Fe. If there's a legal question about that claim, I can help you find the right people to talk to." She had not asked him for this. She had not expected it. She looked at him for a long moment in the slanting afternoon light and felt something complicated move through her, something that was gratitude and surprise and something else that she was not quite ready to examine directly. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to consider this seriously. "Because it's the right thing," he said, "and because I would rather spend my time on the right thing than the wrong one." It was, she thought, a very characteristic answer. They rode into the New Mexico territory on a morning when the air was so clear and sharp it felt like it had been freshly made, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains were visible to the northeast in a long blue wall that seemed to rise directly out of the earth. Louise had been prepared to be disappointed by the country, had braced herself for the reality of it to be lesser than her father's descriptions, but the reality was, if anything, more. The land was red and gold and sage green, layered and dramatic, scored by arroyos and broken by the sudden vertical drama of canyon walls, and the sky above it was a shade of blue so intense it almost hurt to look at. Marshall had been watching her take it in, and when she turned to look at him, there was something open in his expression that she had not seen there before, something unguarded. "It gets you," he said, "the first time you really see it." "Yes," she said, "it does." They reached the town of Cimarron 2 days after crossing the territorial line. Cimarron in 1879 was a proper town, larger than some of the settlements she had passed through, with a hotel and a general store and a land office, and a newspaper and several establishments whose purposes were less wholesome. It sat in the Cimarron River Valley with a comfortable permanence, surrounded by the kind of landscape that made you understand why people had been fighting over this region for the better part of a century. Louise went directly to the land office. Marshall came with her, standing quietly to one side while she presented her documents, her father's original survey records, the deed, the copy of the inheritance papers that she had drawn up by a Cincinnati attorney before she left. The land office clerk, a thin young man with spectacles, examined everything carefully and then told her that the claim was valid, that it had been registered in Franklin Rhodes's name in 1876, and that as his sole legal heir, the land was hers. She had not expected to cry. She was not, as a general rule, a woman who cried easily. But standing in that small, dusty office with the smell of ink and paper around her, holding her father's survey records, she felt her eyes fill and had to blink several times and look at a spot on the wall until she had herself back under control. Marshall, she noticed, was looking very carefully at the window during this process. She thanked the clerk. She filed the appropriate documents confirming her identity and her intention to take possession of the property. She sent a letter to her uncle via the telegram office next door that was brief and entirely civil, and contained no words that were specifically impolite, but which she felt certain communicated her position with absolute clarity. That evening, she and Marshall ate supper at the hotel dining room, which was the best meal Louise had eaten in 3 weeks, roasted chicken and fresh bread, and something that resembled a pie, and they drank coffee that was also better than anything she had encountered on the road. The dining room was half full, ranchers and their wives, a few traveling merchants, a table of men who were playing cards in the corner with the particular intensity of people who take cards very seriously. They talked for a long time, longer than they had talked on the road, somehow, because on the road there was always the business of traveling to occupy them, the navigation and the camp-making and the practical demands of moving through country. Here, over the remnants of a good supper, with no particular place to be, the conversation could be about other things. He asked her what she planned to do with the land. She told him. She had been thinking about this for the entire journey, had been turning it over and examining it from different angles the way you examine a rock you have picked up, looking for the useful facets. She wanted cattle, she said, a small herd to start with. She knew nothing about cattle as yet, which was a problem she intended to solve through inquiry and observation, and the application of willingness to learn. She wanted to build on what her father had already started. There was apparently a small cabin on the property, basic but sound according to his last letter, and a well that produced reliable water. Marshall listened to all of this with the serious attention he gave to everything, and when she finished, he said, "You'll need help at least to start." "I know that," she said. "I intend to hire it." "Good ranch hands are particular about who they work for," he said, not unkindly. "A woman alone, running a spread, that's not unprecedented in the territory, but it's uncommon enough that you'll have some persuading to do." "I am aware," she said, and she said it with a directness that made him almost smile, which she was learning to recognize as a significant event in the geography of his face. "I know a man," he said, "retired from my circuit about 2 years ago, name of Pete Dunbar. He ranched in this valley before his knees gave out on him. He knows every rancher and every hand within 50 miles, and he has a reputation for good judgment. He might be willing to help you find the right people." "That's kind of you," she said. "It's practical," he said, and then more quietly and kind, "both." She looked at him across the table in the warm light of the dining room lamps and felt that thing again, the complicated thing. And this time she looked at it more directly instead of away, and found that it was something she recognized after all, though she had not expected to encounter it here, in a hotel dining room in New Mexico, at the end of a 3-week journey that had been about land and documents and independence and nothing else, or so she had thought. She realized with a sort of startled clarity, falling in love with Marshall McCrae. The thought sat in her with an odd mixture of delight and alarm, because she had not come west to fall in love with anyone. She had come west because she was her father's daughter and the land was hers, and she had refused to sign away either. She had come west because she had looked at the soft life on offer in Boston and known with her whole self that it was the wrong life. She had not come west for a man, and she would have said so to anyone who asked, and she would have meant it completely, and she was still entirely sincere in that position. But here was Marshall McCrae, with his dark eyes and his patient intelligence and his good understanding of right and wrong, and here was this feeling, and she supposed the territory had surprised her in more ways than she had anticipated. She did not say any of this. She drank her coffee and talked about practical matters, about the cabin and the water and the question of what breed of cattle would do best in this climate. And Marshall answered her practical questions with the same seriousness he brought to everything. And they parted at the foot of the hotel stairs with a good night that was perfectly appropriate and not the slightest bit dramatic. But she lay awake for a while after, listening to the sounds of Cimarron settling into its nighttime rhythms, and thought about it. Pete Dunbar was exactly what Marshall had described, a compact, weathered man of about 55 with bad knees and good sense, who lived in a small house on the edge of town and spent his retirement dispensing advice to anyone willing to sit down and listen. He received Louise the following morning with a straightforward hospitality that she found enormously refreshing after weeks of people looking at her with varying degrees of concern and incredulity. And he talked with her for 2 hours about the land and the cattle business and the particular challenges and possibilities of the Cimarron Valley. By the end of that conversation, he had agreed to help her find hands, had given her the name of a man who sold good cattle at reasonable prices, and had provided a detailed assessment of what the first year would likely require in terms of labor and investment. He did all of this without once suggesting that what she was undertaking was unusual or inadvisable for a woman, which made her like him very much. Marshall had come with her to that meeting and had sat largely quiet throughout it, which she was also coming to appreciate as a distinct skill of his, the ability to be present and available without inserting himself where he was not needed. They rode out to the land the next day, she and Marshall and Pete Dunbar, who came along in a wagon because his knees would not permit a long ride on horseback. The property was 12 miles south of town, down a good road that followed the river through increasingly beautiful country, and when they turned off the road and onto the property itself, Louise pulled Clara to a stop at the top of a low rise and looked out over what her father had claimed. It was not, as her uncle had described it, worthless scrubland. It was 700 acres of river valley and rolling hill country, with good grass that was just coming into its spring green, and a line of cottonwoods along the river that caught the morning light in their new leaves and turned it gold. The cabin was visible from the rise, a small structure of adobe and timber, very basic but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a lean-to stable attached. There was a kitchen garden plot that had been neglected but not destroyed, and the well her father had mentioned, its wooden cover weathered gray by 3 years of sun and wind. Louise sat on her horse and looked at all of it for a long moment and felt something settle in her chest, something large and complicated that had been wound tight since the morning in Cincinnati, releasing now with a slowness that felt almost physical. This was his, she said, not quite to anyone in particular. Marshall had pulled his horse up beside her. He did not say anything, but he was there, solidly and quietly present, and that was enough. They spent the rest of the day on the property. She and Pete Dunbar walked most of it on foot, which was hard on his knees but which he bore without complaint, pointing out the good grass and the reliable water, and the places where fencing would be most effective. Marshall fixed the cabin door, which had swollen in its frame and no longer closed properly, using tools from Pete's wagon with a calm competence that she watched while pretending not to watch. When they rode back to town in the late afternoon, Pete had given her a list of 4 men he thought might be interested in ranch work, and Marshall had quietly repaired most of what had been wrong with the cabin door, and also patched a section of roof that had begun to show a worrying gap. That evening she sat in her hotel room and wrote letters, one to the cattle seller Pete had named, one to the land office confirming her intention to begin active operation of the property, and one long letter to no one in particular, which she later burned, in which she attempted to work out what she was feeling about Marshall McCrae and arrived at no satisfying conclusions. The first of Pete's recommended hands, a young man of 22 named Dario Vega, came to see her the following morning. Dario was the son of a Mexican ranching family from the southern part of the territory, and he spoke both English and Spanish with equal fluency, and had been working cattle since he was old enough to sit a horse, which by his own estimation was approximately age 4. He was direct and good-humored, and showed no sign whatsoever of finding it remarkable that his potential employer was a woman from Ohio who had never worked a cattle operation, and he was hired within 30 minutes. The second and third hands, brothers named Sam and Hector Oakes, arrived the following afternoon, and they were also hired, being experienced, honest, and willing to work for the wages she could afford, which were reasonable rather than generous. The fourth man Pete had recommended did not appear, having apparently taken a position elsewhere, but by that point she had 3 capable hands and enough of a beginning to get started, and getting started was what she intended to do. Marshall had been in town for 5 days now, which was longer than his circuit work strictly required, and she was aware of this, and suspected he was also aware of it, and had decided not to address it directly. He helped where help was useful and stayed out of the way where it was not, and each evening they ate supper together in the hotel dining room and talked about the day and about larger things, history and geography, and what they each believed about the world. And each evening she walked up the hotel stairs feeling more certain about something she still had not said out loud. On the 6th evening she said it. They had walked out after supper, which had been their habit when the evening was pleasant, down to the river where there was a bench someone had placed under the cottonwood trees for reasons that were presumably civic, and they were sitting there in the blue dusk when Louise turned to him and said, "Are you going to leave soon?" He looked at her. "I have to get back on circuit," he said. "I've been away too long already." "Yes," she said, "I know." They were both quiet for a moment. The river made its constant small sound over the stones, and somewhere nearby a nighthawk was calling. "I don't want you to," she said then very clearly, because she had decided that if she was going to say it, she was going to say it the whole way and not leave him to guess at it. "I don't want you to leave. I'm telling you that directly because I think you deserve directness, and because I have been thinking about it for several days, and this is where I have arrived." Marshall looked at the river. Then he looked back at her. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it, all the careful professional steadiness she had observed over 3 weeks of travel stripped away or set aside, and what was underneath it was something that she recognized because it matched what was happening in her own chest. "Louise," he said. "I know it's fast," she said. "I know we have only known each other for 3 weeks of riding through difficult country. I also know that I understand you better than I have ever understood anyone I met in 3 months of Cincinnati parlors, and I know what I feel, and I think you feel something too, or I have read you completely wrong, which is possible but unlikely." He almost laughed. The corner of his mouth did the thing it did when he was containing amusement, and then he let the amusement all the way out, a real smile, warm and genuine, and it transformed his whole face in a way that made something catch in her throat. "You have not read me wrong," he said. "Good," she said. "I am also not good at this," he said, which she suspected was honest. "I have not had cause to be good at it for a long time." "Neither have I," she said, which was completely true. "I don't know what to do about the circuit work," he said, and she could hear that this was the genuine complication, not an excuse but a real problem. "It's not the kind of work you can just leave." "I know that," she said. "I'm not asking you to leave it. I'm only saying what I feel so that you have the information." He looked at her for a long time in the fading light, and she looked back at him, and then he reached over and took her hand very carefully, as if she were something worth being careful with, and held it. His hand was large and weathered and warm, and she turned her palm against his and held on. "I feel it too," he said. "I've been feeling it since about the 3rd day on the road, when you told off that trader in the most precise language I have ever heard applied to a man who was trying to overcharge for flour." She laughed, a genuine surprised laugh. "He was overcharging by 30%. You were absolutely right," he said, "and I thought, here is a woman who knows exactly what things are worth and is not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of anyone's comfort. Is that a compliment?" "It is the highest compliment I know how to give," he said, and he was serious. She looked at him in the last light of the evening. This lean, weathered, honest man who had ridden down a slope at exactly the right moment 3 weeks ago and had stayed at her side ever since without being asked. And she thought that her father would have liked him very much. And she thought that the land 12 miles south of them was going to need someone to help build it into the thing she could see in her imagination. And she thought that she was the kind of woman who, when she knew something, knew it completely. "Come back," she said. "When your circuit is done, come back here." "I will," he said, and that was that. He left the next morning early, before the town had quite woken up, and she stood in front of the hotel and watched him ride north with Clara watching from the hitching post beside her, and she felt the leaving like a specific thing, a physical absence where something had recently been present. She also felt the steadiness of what he had said, the "I will," which was not a promise made carelessly. She turned back to the business of building something. The weeks that followed were the hardest work of Louise Rhodes's life, and also the most satisfying, in the way that hard work done toward a clear purpose is always more satisfying than easy work done toward someone else's ends. She moved out to the cabin with her 3 hands and began the serious business of making the property functional. Dario was invaluable. He knew cattle and he knew the land and he knew the network of relationships that made a ranch operation work, which suppliers were honest, which neighbors could be counted on for the mutual aid that was an unspoken currency of the territory, which wells were shared and how, which roads were better in which weather. He did all of this without making her feel that she was being managed, which she appreciated enormously, because she had a strong and abiding objection to being managed. She bought her first cattle in June, a small herd of 30 cows and 2 bulls from the rancher Pete had recommended, a weathered giant of a man named Elias Tanner who sold her good animals and threw in 2 calves that had been orphaned by their mothers as something he called a neighbor gesture. She drove the herd back to the property herself, with Dario and the Oaks brothers, over 2 long dusty days, and by the time they arrived, she felt she had earned every inch of the knowledge she had acquired. She also built the cabin out. Dario and the Oaks brothers helped, and she worked alongside them, learning the particular logic of adobe construction as she went, how to mix the mud and the straw in the right proportions, how to fill a wall's worth of brick molds, and wait for the sun to do its slow work. The cabin gained a second room and a proper kitchen area and a porch that ran along the south side and caught the afternoon light in a way that made it the best seat in the territory, in her considered opinion. She wrote to Marshall once, a single letter that was mostly practical information about the property and the cattle and the Oaks brothers' recent discovery of a secondary spring on the north pasture that added considerably to the property's water security, with 1 paragraph near the end that departed from the practical, and said simply that she thought about their conversation by the river regularly, and hoped his circuit was going well, and that the offer of come back remained open and sincere. He wrote back, a letter that took 3 weeks to arrive and that she read sitting on her new porch in the late afternoon light. His letter was also mostly practical, circuit news and territory information, and a useful observation about the breed of cattle she had selected, with 1 paragraph near the end that said he thought about the river conversation too, and that comeback was not merely a plan but an intention, and that he expected to be free of his current commitments by October. It was August. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box she kept under her bunk with her father's survey records and her important documents, and went back to the cattle. The summer was eventful in the ways that a first operational season is always eventful, which is to say there were problems of varying severity that required solutions of varying creativity. A section of fence along the east boundary came down in a storm, and she spent 2 days rebuilding it with Sam Oaks, while Dario and Hector located and returned the cattle that had wandered through the gap. The older of the 2 bulls developed a foot ailment that required treatment and considerable wrestling to administer, a project that she participated in directly, and which left her mud-covered but successful. The kitchen garden that her father had begun recovered well from its years of neglect once she gave it attention and water, and by July it was producing well enough to supplement their supplies meaningfully. She became, in the course of the summer, a known quantity in the Cimarron Valley. She attended the community meetings that were held in the town hall in Cimarron on the first Monday of each month, where the ranchers and farmers of the valley discussed water rights and road maintenance and the ongoing complications of territorial governance. She was initially an object of some curiosity at these meetings, a young woman alone running a property, but she consistently had useful things to say, and she said them clearly and without apology, and by the 3rd meeting she was simply one of the people who attended and whose opinions were taken into account. She met her neighbors in the normal course of things. The nearest ranch to the east was operated by a family named Castellano, 3 generations of them living and working on land they had held under Spanish land grant for 100 years, and old Maria Castellano, who was the acknowledged head of the family, came to call on Louise in July with a gift of preserves and a directness of manner that Louise found completely refreshing. They became friends with a rapidity that surprised neither of them. Two women who had each, in their different ways, decided what they wanted from the land they stood on and had gone about obtaining it without excessive fuss. Maria Castellano also had opinions about Marshall McCrae, who she had met at some point in his circuit work, and whom she described as the most honest man carrying a badge that she had encountered in 30 years of territorial life, which was high praise from a woman who had seen quite a bit of territorial life. "He will come back," Maria said, one afternoon in late August when they were sitting on Louise's porch with coffee, because Louise had mentioned in passing that he was expected in October. "Men like that, when they say they will come back, they come back." "I know," Louise said, and found that she did know it, with the same certainty she had about the good grass in the south pasture and the reliability of the north spring. He came back on the 14th of October, which was a Tuesday, in the late afternoon when the light was long and golden across the valley, and the cottonwoods along the river had turned entirely, a brilliant yellow that was the most beautiful thing she had seen since the first time she had stood on the rise and looked out over this land. She saw him coming from a distance, the familiar lean figure on the familiar horse, moving south along the road from town, and she was on her porch when he turned up the track to her property, and she was standing at the edge of the porch steps when he pulled up in front of her. He looked at her for a moment, and she looked at him, and then he swung down from the horse and walked up to her and took her face in his hands with a deliberateness that suggested he had been thinking about this for some time, and he kissed her. She kissed him back with equal deliberateness, because she had been thinking about it too. He stayed. He did not abandon his circuit work immediately. That would not have been right, and she would not have wanted it to be right. But he arranged with the territorial marshal's office to take a smaller circuit, one that kept him in the Cimarron and Taos area rather than ranging across the whole of the territory. And that meant he was on the property more often than not and away for stretches of no more than a week at a time. They built a life together with the same practical thoroughness they each brought to every other undertaking. He was a natural rancher in ways he had apparently not known before, having the patience and the particular attentiveness to animal behavior that good cattle management required. And by the end of October, he had taken over the primary care of the bulls and was learning the rest with the same serious quietness he brought to everything. She was simultaneously learning everything she could from Dario and from Elias Tanner, and from Maria Castellano's son Raphael, who had been working cattle in this valley since he was a boy, and who was generous with his knowledge in the way that people who are secure in their expertise generally are. The evenings were the best part. After the work was done, and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse that they had built in September with salvaged timber and considerable collective effort, she and Marshall would sit on the porch in the cooling dark and talk, sometimes about the ranch, sometimes about the territory, sometimes about nothing in particular, the conversation ranging and easy the way conversation is when you are with someone who knows how to listen. He told her things he had not told her on the road. He told her about Missouri and about his childhood, which had been poor but not harsh, in the way of families who are short on money but not on the kind of closeness that makes poverty bearable. He told her about the first time he had put on a badge and what it had felt like, the weight of it and the responsibility of it, and the gradual understanding that law in the territories was less a fixed thing than a negotiation between what was written and what was possible. He told her about his wife, who had been called Anna, and about the particular grief of losing someone before you have had time to know them as well as you had intended to, and he talked about it without self-pity, which made it possible for her to hear it clearly. She told him things she had not told anyone. She told him about the loneliness of being her father's intellectual companion while also being, in the eyes of Cincinnati society, a woman whose primary purpose was to be advantageously married, and how she had spent her 20s in the strange double existence of someone who is quite content in their own mind, but is constantly being measured against a standard they have no interest in meeting. She told him that she had not been sure, on the morning she walked out of her uncle's house in Cincinnati, that she was brave so much as desperate, that the soft life had felt less like an offer and more like a cage with upholstered furniture, and that she had signed nothing and ridden west not because she had been certain it would work, but because she had been certain that the alternative would not. "I am glad you rode west," he said. "So am I," she said. In November, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the way that suited him, which was directly, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold while he thought through how to say it, and then simply saying it, that he loved her and wanted to build this life with her formally as well as practically, and that he thought they would be good at being married to each other. And would she? She said yes before he had quite finished the question, which made him laugh, a real open laugh. And then she said yes again clearly in case she had been unclear the first time. And he stood up, and she stood up, and they held on to each other in the middle of their kitchen in the November light with the smell of wood smoke and coffee around them. And it felt like the most solid and right thing she had ever done. They were married in December, in the Cimarron town hall, because the church had a roof problem that was not yet resolved, and the officiating was done by a justice of the peace, named Hopkins, who had known Marshall for years, and who conducted the ceremony with a warmth and a matter-of-factness that suited them both perfectly. Pete Dunbar was there, and Dario and the Oaks brothers, and Maria and Raphael Castellano and 3 of the Castellano children, and Elias Tanner and his wife, and a dozen other people from the valley whom Louise had accumulated in the past several months, and who had apparently decided she was worth knowing. It was not a grand wedding. The food was good, contributed from many directions in the custom of the valley, and the music was provided by Raphael Castellano, who played the guitar with a skill that was entirely beyond what Louise had expected, and everyone ate and talked, and the occasion was the kind of happy that comes from people who genuinely wish 2 people well being gathered together to say so. Maria Castellano had brought a bottle of something she called brandy from the region she called home, a homeland in the northern part of New Mexico that her family had occupied before it was New Mexico, and she poured it into small glasses and gave one to Louise and one to Marshall, and said something in Spanish that was clearly a toast, and Louise did not speak Spanish then, but understood the feeling of it completely. She was 24 years old and she was married and the land was hers, and the life she was building on it was nothing like the soft life she had been offered in Boston, and she would not have traded a single inch of it. The first full year of the Rhodes McCrae ranch, which they named the Cimarron Cross after the point where the river bent and crossed their property line, was the most educational year of Louise's life, and she had been educated at some length in Cincinnati and had thought herself reasonably informed about the world. She learned that cattle have individual personalities and strong opinions about how their days should go. She learned that New Mexico territory, weather in January, is an entirely different animal from Ohio, weather in January, drier and colder in ways that require specific and serious preparation. She learned that the network of relationships in the valley was as important to the ranch's survival as the grass and water, that a rancher who was not willing to help their neighbor in the spring branding would not find their neighbor available when their own fence came down in the summer. Marshall's circuit work continued, though he had successfully renegotiated it down to a much smaller area, and his reputation in the valley was a useful thing, not because he invoked it but because people knew who he was and what kind of man he was, and that knowledge smoothed certain interactions that might otherwise have been rough. There were, as there always were in the territories of that era, disputes and difficulties that required careful navigation, water rights arguments between neighboring ranches, the ongoing complicated politics of the territorial government, the presence of a new railroad survey that was running through the valley and raising questions about land access that no one had entirely anticipated. Louise attended to the ranch's affairs with a thoroughness that Dario had privately told Sam Oaks, who had privately told Pete Dunbar, who had told Maria Castellano with unconcealed satisfaction, was the most organized approach to ranch management he had seen in 15 years of working cattle. She kept meticulous records. She knew every animal on her property by sight and most of them by name, which Elias Tanner said was unusual but not useless. She expanded the kitchen garden, built a proper root cellar with Sam Oak's considerable help, and negotiated a water-sharing agreement with the Castellano Ranch that was fair to both parties and had been drawn up in writing and signed by both sides and filed with the land office, because she had learned that verbal agreements were less durable than they should be. In the spring of 1880, she was pregnant. She discovered this in March, which was still cold in the mornings and warm by afternoon, and she told Marshall on a Sunday when he was home, and they were eating breakfast, and she had decided that the directness that had served her well in all other areas of her life would serve her well in this one too. He set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something very large and slightly stunned and enormously warm, and then he reached across the table and took her hand, and he held it for quite a while without saying anything, which was entirely appropriate because there was nothing to say that the holding did not already communicate. "A son or a daughter," he said eventually. "Either way." "Either way," she agreed. She continued to work the ranch through her pregnancy, which she felt strongly about and which she managed carefully, with the help of Maria Castellano, who had delivered 3 children in locations ranging from a hospital in Santa Fe to the back of a wagon on the road to Taos, and who approached the subject of childbirth with the same practical directness she applied to everything else. Maria told her what to do and what not to do, what to eat and what to watch for, and checked on her with a regularity that was both useful and, occasionally, slightly more than Louise had strictly requested, though she never said so because she was also genuinely grateful. Their son was born in October of 1880, a fact that Louise found satisfying because it meant he had come into the world in the best season, when the cottonwoods were gold and the light was long and the worst of the summer heat was well past. He was born in the cabin with Maria Castellano in attendance, and Marshall present throughout in a state of controlled anxiety that he managed with considerable dignity. And when it was done, and the baby was cleaned and placed in Louise's arms, Marshall sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them with an expression that was entirely without any of the professional composure she had spent the past year learning to read and enjoy. They named him Franklin, after her father. Marshall had suggested it without any prompting, which told her a great deal about who he was, because he understood that the name mattered and he offered it freely. Franklin McCrae was a robust baby with his mother's dark eyes and his father's angular jaw and strong opinions about the timing of his meals that he communicated without reserve. The ranch accommodated him the way a place accommodates something that was always meant to be there. Dario, who had a large family and was accustomed to babies, was practical and helpful about it. Sam Oakes, who was less accustomed to babies, was initially uncertain what to do with himself, but had by December developed a habit of stopping by the cabin on some pretext every evening to report the day's cattle news, and incidentally to see how the baby was doing. The Cimarron Cross expanded in 1881, when Marshall completed his arrangements with the Territorial Marshal's office and left the circuit work entirely to concentrate on the ranch. This was not a decision made lightly, and Louise did not press it, because she understood that the work mattered to him and that leaving it was a real cost, not merely a logistical adjustment. He thought about it for months before he decided, and when he decided, he was sure, and once he was sure, he did not look back. With Marshall's full attention and effort added to what they already had, the ranch grew in ways that felt earned rather than sudden. They increased the herd carefully, buying good animals and selling the surplus at prices that reflected the quality of the stock, building a reputation in the valley market that made buyers seek them out rather than the reverse. They hired 2 additional hands, a young Navajo man named Thomas Runningwater, who had grown up in this part of the territory, and had a relationship with the land that was older and deeper than anything Louise could claim, and which she respected enormously, and a Mexican-American cowboy named Ramona Fuentes, who was 19 and extraordinarily capable on horseback, and who had been working someone else's cattle for 2 years and was ready for better conditions. Ramona Fuentes, which was a name that caused some surprise among the established ranchers of the valley, who had not previously encountered a female ranch hand, was hired because Louise had watched her work for 30 minutes on the day she came to inquire about a position, and had made the decision before the 30 minutes were up. Marshall had observed this hiring process with his characteristic quiet and afterward said only, "Good eye," which was, from him, a significant endorsement. The territory was changing around them, as it had been changing since before they arrived and would continue to change after their own lives were done, because the West was in that particular period of its history when everything was in motion and nothing was yet settled. The railroad came through the valley in 1882, which brought both opportunity and complication. Opportunity in the form of better access to markets and supplies, complication in the form of new arrivals with different ideas about how the land should be used. There were more disputes, more negotiations, more moments when the law had to be clear about what was permitted and what was not. Marshall, who had left the badge but not the understanding that came with wearing it, was often called upon in these disputes to serve in an unofficial capacity, mediating between parties who had reached the point of shouting but had not yet reached the point of shooting, which was the more manageable part of the spectrum. He did this without pay and without any formal authority, simply because he was good at it and because it mattered, and Louise watched him in these moments with a love and a pride that was quiet and entirely real. They had a second child in 1883, a daughter they named Clara, after the horse who had carried Louise west in 1879. Clara Rhodes had been retired to a pasture life of considerable comfort on the Cimarron Cross, which she seemed to find satisfactory, and Clara McCrae, who was born in April and was from her first hours a person of strong preferences and clear expression, seemed to find the world equally to her liking. The cabin had been added to twice by this point, so that it was less a cabin than a proper house, adobe and timber, and a stone fireplace that Marshall had built in the second year with the help of Rafael Castellano, who had learned masonry from his grandfather and was happy to teach what he knew. The porch still ran along the south side and was still the best seat in the territory, and on summer evenings Louise and Marshall would sit there after the children were down and the day was done, and the conversation was the same conversation it had always been between them, ranging and comfortable and real, with the valley going dark around them and the stars coming out overhead with the extravagance that the territory's clear air permitted. There were hard things, too, because life in the territories was not a simple matter, and the times they were living through were complicated by forces larger than any single ranch or family. The land disputes that had been simmering through the early years of the decade came to a head in the summer of 1883 when a land syndicate from back east, the kind of organization that bought and consolidated range land in large parcels for speculative purposes, began acquiring properties in the valley through means that were not always clearly legal. Several smaller operations were bought out under pressure, the pressure being the withdrawal of credit and the calling in of debts in coordination with the syndicate's acquisition offers. Louise and Marshall were not small enough to be bullied easily, but they were not beyond the syndicate's interest, and in the autumn of 1883 they received a visit from a representative of the organization, a man named Caldwell who wore a good suit and carried a document proposing the purchase of the Cimarron Cross at a price that was below its actual value, but not so far below as to be immediately offensive. Louise sat across the table from Caldwell in her kitchen and read the document carefully, all of it, every line, the way she had read the document in her uncle's parlor in Cincinnati 4 years ago. And when she finished, she looked up at him and declined, clearly and without hesitation. Caldwell said a number of things about the changing nature of the territory and the advantages of liquid capital over land holdings, and the challenges facing smaller independent operators in the evolving market of the 1880s. Louise listened to all of it politely, and then said again, with the same clarity, that she would not be selling. Marshall, who had been standing by the kitchen door during this conversation in the way he had of being present without looming, met Caldwell's eyes when Caldwell glanced at him and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Caldwell left. The syndicate made one more approach the following spring, this time by letter, and Louise wrote back the following day declining again in terms that were entirely civil and left no ambiguity whatsoever about her position, and that was the last they heard of it. The syndicate did not get everything it wanted in the Cimarron Valley. The community of ranchers and farmers there, which had built itself over years into something with genuine mutual investment, proved harder to dismantle than the syndicate's organizers had perhaps anticipated. The water-sharing agreements and the community meetings and the accumulated networks of obligation and goodwill that made the valley function turned out to be, in practice, a kind of collective resilience that no single organization could easily overcome. Some properties were sold, some families left, but the valley as a working community remained intact, which was due in no small part to the fact that the people in it had been paying attention and had prepared for exactly this kind of pressure. Maria Castellano, at the community meeting in the fall of 1883, had said something that Louise thought about for years afterward. She had said in her direct and unhurried way that the land always outlasts the men who think they can own it completely, and that the best thing any of them could do was make themselves part of the land in a way that was so thorough and so real that extracting them from it became more trouble than it was worth. It was, Louise thought, excellent advice. She had been following it, more or less, since the day she stood on the rise and looked out at her father's land for the first time. The years settled into each other the way years do when you are living in a place and building something there, each one distinct and full of its own particular events, and each one also part of a longer accumulation that gives your life its shape. Franklin grew into a boy of serious intelligence and enormous energy who followed his father everywhere on the ranch and his mother into the accounts ledger, and had opinions about both cattle management and arithmetic before he was 7. Clara grew into a person of very strong character and great personal warmth, who was her grandmother Maria's favorite, and who could ride a horse with considerable skill by the time she was 4, a fact that surprised no one who had known either of her parents. They had a third child in 1886, another son, whom they named Robert Franklin McCrae, after a deputy of Marshall's old acquaintance who had died in the service of the law in 1884, a good and honest man whose memory Marshall wanted to carry forward in a way that mattered. Robert came into the world in February, in the deep cold of a New Mexico winter, and immediately demonstrated a disposition that was sunnier than the season of his birth, laughing at things that other babies regarded with seriousness, and regarding with genuine interest things that other babies would have overlooked entirely. He was, by general consensus, a remarkably good-natured person almost from the beginning. Marshall and Louise were, by the mid-1880s, people of modest but genuine prosperity and considerable community standing. The Cimarron Cross ran 400 head of cattle and employed 6 hands, a number that included Thomas Runningwater, who was still there after 5 years, and had become as essential to the operation as the water source itself, and Ramona Fuentes, who had stayed also and had bought a small parcel of land of her own adjacent to the cross where she was quietly building her own operation with a focused efficiency that Louise found entirely admirable. Marshall continued the unofficial mediation work that the valley seemed to require of him, because his particular combination of legal knowledge and human understanding, and the residual authority of having worn a badge for a decade, was rare enough that people sought it out. He did it willingly, without complaint, understanding that it was part of what it meant to live in a community rather than merely in a place. Louise ran the financial end of the operation with the meticulous attention she had always brought to it, and also sat on the board of the newly established Valley School, which had been a project of hers since 1882, because she had strong opinions about education, and particularly about the education of girls, having herself been educated well enough to be of use in the world, but not in an environment that fully understood why that usefulness mattered. The Valley School that she helped establish was unapologetically educational for all of its students, regardless of their origins or their family circumstances, which was an approach that caused mild controversy among certain parties and no controversy whatsoever among the people who were actually using it. She was 31 years old in 1886, which was the year of Robert's birth, and she sat on her porch on the evening of her birthday, which was in June, the best time of year in the valley when everything was green and the river was running full, and the smell of sage was everywhere in the warm evening air, and she looked out at the land her father had claimed and she had built into something real. And she thought about the morning in Cincinnati 7 years ago when she had looked at a piece of paper and made the decision that had led her here. She had been offered a soft life. She had signed nothing and ridden west, into country she did not know, toward a future she could only partly imagine, and what she had found was harder and more complicated and infinitely more real than anything that had been offered to her in that parlor on Vine Street. Marshall came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside her, close, in the way he always sat beside her, as if proximity were its own argument, and handed her one of the cups. The children were inside, the sound of them a warm background noise, Franklin arguing with Clara about something that had the complete seriousness of a children's argument, Robert's laugh rising over both of them at irregular intervals. "Happy birthday," Marshall said. "Thank you," she said. They sat for a while in the comfortable quiet that 7 years of marriage had made between them, a quiet that had texture and meaning rather than emptiness. "Do you ever think about Boston?" he asked. It was not a question he asked often, but he asked it occasionally, with the careful interest of a man who wants to know the full geography of the person he loves. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "I think about what it would have been. Very comfortable, very contained." "Do you regret it?" She looked at him, this man who had ridden down a slope at exactly the right moment and stayed, who had learned her language of directness and given her his own, who had built 3 children with her and 400 acres of working ranch and a life that was genuinely hers, and she said, "No, not for a single moment." He looked at her in the evening light, this woman who had walked away from the easy thing 7 years ago and built the hard thing into something better than the easy thing had ever been, and he said, "Neither do I." The valley went dark around them in its gradual way, the sky moving through blue and violet and the first scattered stars appearing overhead, and the river made its constant sound below them, and the cattle were somewhere in the south pasture, their occasional lowing a distant, homely sound, and the children were inside arguing about something and laughing, and Louise Rhodes, who was Louise McCrae now but who had always been and would always be also Louise Rhodes, held her coffee with both hands and looked out at the land and felt the profound satisfaction of a person who has made the right choice and has had the grace and the grit to see it through. In the years that followed, the Cimarron cross continued to grow, slowly and carefully, because neither Louise nor Marshall believed in growth for its own sake, but only growth that added to what was already sound. They acquired an adjacent parcel in 1888 when its elderly owner, A man named Gideon Hawks, who had been ranching there since before the Civil War, decided to move to his daughter's home in Colorado and sold the land to them at a fair price, with a handshake agreement that he seemed to find entirely satisfying, because he had watched the Cimarron Cross operate for 9 years and approved of what he had seen. Franklin, who was 8 in 1888, showed an aptitude for the practical mathematics of the ranch operation that his mother found delightful, and his father found somewhat formidable, because at 8 the boy could do sums in his head faster than Marshall could work them on paper. He was also learning to ride with the seriousness he brought to everything, and Ramona Fuentes, who was the finest rider on the property, had taken it upon herself to teach him the things that could not be learned from watching, which were many and specific. Clara, who was 5, had decided that she intended to be a doctor, a decision she had arrived at after watching the Valley's traveling physician deal with a difficult situation involving Hector Oak's broken arm, and which she had announced at supper with the calm certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than expressing a preference. Neither Louise nor Marshall had suggested this was impractical, because they had not raised their children to be told that things were impractical without evidence, and the evidence on Clara's character and intelligence suggested that impractical was not the most useful word to apply. Robert, who was 2, was mostly interested in dogs and in the chickens that Louise kept in a pen behind the kitchen garden, and in the particular project of getting from one end of the porch to the other as fast as possible on his still uncertain legs, a project he pursued with a joyful tenacity that made everyone who watched him smile. Pete Dunbar died in the winter of 1889, quietly, in his own bed in his house in Cimarron, which was how he had said he intended to go, and which was a more comfortable end than most people managed in the territory. He had been 70 years old and had kept his good sense until the last, and had told Louise at their final meeting that watching the Cimarron Cross develop had been one of the genuine pleasures of his retirement. She missed him particularly and sincerely, and she and Marshall attended his funeral with Franklin and Clara, and paid their respects in the direct and personal way that he had always preferred over ceremony. Maria Castellano lived on, apparently indefinitely, because she was the kind of person who does not concede ground to time any more than to anyone else. She was somewhere in her 60s now, though the exact number was a subject she addressed with the same pragmatic vagueness she brought to anything she found unnecessary to specify, and she was still the most formidable person in the Cimarron Valley, which was saying something. She came to dinner at the Cimarron Cross the first Sunday of every month, a practice she had established in the early years and maintained with the consistency of someone who knows a good arrangement when they find one, and these dinners were the occasion of the best conversations Louise had in any given month. Maria's view of the world was broad and deep, built on the specific and painful history of a family that had watched sovereignty over this land pass from Spain to Mexico to the United States without ever having been truly consulted about any of it, and she spoke about this history with a clarity and a lack of sentimentality that Louise found both important and humbling. It was Maria who told her about the land grant cases that were moving through the territorial courts, the complicated legal battles over properties that had been held by Spanish and Mexican families for generations, and were now being challenged by new claims from Anglo settlers and land speculators, a situation that was unjust in ways that Louise saw clearly even as she acknowledged that the resolution of it was beyond any single person's power to fix. She supported the Castellano family's legal efforts where she could, providing character testimony and documentation of the water sharing agreements that established the Castellano ranch's continuous operation of the land in question, and she spoke about it plainly at community meetings when the subject arose, which it did with increasing frequency as the 1880s became the 1890s and the territory began seriously considering statehood. The world was changing again, as it always was. The open-range era that had defined cattle ranching in the territories was giving way to a more settled, more fenced, more legally complex system. The railroad had brought new people and new money and new ideas, some of which were improvements, and some of which were simply new ways of doing old damage. And navigating the difference required exactly the kind of attention and intelligence that Louise and Marshall had both been bringing to their lives for the past decade. Dario Vega married a woman named Esperanza in the summer of 1890, a ceremony held at the Castellano property with enough food and music for 3 celebrations, and they moved into a small house on the Cimarron Cross property that had been built originally as additional hand quarters, but which Louise and Marshall offered to them as a more permanent arrangement, because Dario was at this point as much a part of the operation as either of them. And having him leave for his own place elsewhere would have been a loss the ranch could not easily absorb. Thomas Runningwater had his own arrangements that Louise did not entirely know the shape of, because he was a private person in ways that were entirely his own business. But he remained at the cross through all of this, solid and reliable and possessed of a knowledge of the land and its creatures that continued to astonish her even after years of working beside him. Ramona Fuentes's own small operation was by the early 1890s a legitimate ranch, small but well managed, and she and Louise had a standing arrangement of mutual aid and shared resources that benefited both properties and which had developed naturally from the years of working together. Ramona was 29 in 1890 and had the confident bearing of someone who has built something with their own hands and knows exactly what it is worth. Sam and Hector Oakes had moved on in 1885, Sam to his own farm further north and Hector to a ranch in Colorado where he eventually married and had a family. But they came through the valley occasionally and always stopped at the Cimarron Cross, where they were fed and welcomed in the way that people who were genuinely part of something's beginning are always welcomed when they return. In 1893, Louise's uncle Gerald died in Philadelphia. She received a letter from a solicitor informing her of this, and noting that Gerald had left a modest estate that was divided among his surviving relatives, of which Louise was one, there being a small amount of money she was entitled to claim if she chose. She sat with this letter for a day and then wrote back to the solicitor, directing that her portion be given to the Cincinnati Public Library, which was an institution her father had valued and which she felt Gerald would have found entirely inappropriate as a recipient of his money, which was a consideration she found, privately, not without its satisfaction. She did not grieve Gerald specifically, but she thought about him, and she thought about the parlor on Vine Street and the document and the offer, and she thought about what her life would have been if she had signed, and the thought produced in her a feeling that was not triumph exactly, but was something adjacent to it, the feeling of a person who has tested their own judgment under real conditions and found it sound. Franklin turned 13 in 1893 and had by that point completed every piece of education the Valley School could offer him, and was studying independently from books that Louise ordered through a supplier in Santa Fe, mathematics and land law and agricultural science, because he had identified what he wanted to know, and was going about learning it with his characteristic systematic thoroughness. He was already doing real work on the ranch, not as a child helping but as a person whose contributions mattered to the operation's daily function, and Marshall had begun including him in the major decisions about herd management and land use with the seriousness that the boy's ability warranted. Clara, at 10, was still intent on medicine, and had added natural sciences to her self-directed study, which Louise supported practically by finding her the relevant books and morally by taking seriously what Clara said about what she was learning, which was a great deal. She was also her father's companion on the circuit of community mediations that still called on Marshall's skills, absorbing the principles of conflict resolution, with the interested attention of someone who is filing information away for later. Robert, at 7, had recently discovered that he had a talent for drawing and was filling every available scrap of paper with careful representations of the animals and landscape around him, rendered with a precision and a sensitivity that suggested something genuine was present. Louise looked at these drawings with the attention they deserved and told him, honestly, that he was good at it, and that being good at something was worth taking seriously. The Cimarron cross was 15 years old in 1894. Louise stood on the porch on the morning of the anniversary and looked out at the land and counted what was there. The house that had grown from a basic cabin into a proper home, the bunkhouse and the stable, and the additional outbuildings that 15 years of effort had added to the property, the cattle visible in the south pasture, the kitchen garden in its late summer abundance, the cottonwood trees along the river in their full summer leaf. She counted the people, Marshall beside her with his coffee, Franklin already down at the stable, Clara in the kitchen helping Dario's wife Esperanza with something that smelled wonderful, Robert asleep for another half hour at least, because Robert was a person who did not consider mornings non-negotiable the way the rest of the family did. She had come here with nothing but her father's deed and her own determination, and a refusal to sign a piece of paper that would have given away something that was hers. She had built from that nothing a real life in a real place with people she genuinely loved and work that genuinely mattered and a piece of ground that she knew as well as she had ever known anything, its particular light at different hours, its moods in different weather, its small topography of ridge and arroyo and river bend as familiar to her as the lines of her own hands. 15 years, she said. Marshall looked out at the same view she was looking at and said, "Yes. Are you happy?" She asked because she asked him this occasionally, not because she doubted the answer but because she thought it was important to say out loud and hear out loud, to make it real rather than only assumed. He looked at her in the morning light, this woman who had ridden into his life on a bay horse with a rifle across her saddlebag, and the complete conviction of someone who knows exactly what they are doing even when they have never done it before, and he said, "Every day." "Good," she said. "So am I." The territory became a state in 1912, New Mexico entering the Union as the 47th state on the 6th of January, which was a cold morning and a significant occasion. Louise and Marshall were in their late 50s by then, which is to say they were older and knew more than they had been and had when they started and were still entirely themselves. Louise still direct and precise, and still the most organized person in the Cimarron Valley. Marshall still patient and honest, and possessed of the particular quiet steadiness that she had known was important the moment she had seen it. Franklin, who was 32 in 1912, had taken over the primary management of the Cimarron Cross several years earlier, with his parents remaining involved but no longer carrying the full operational weight. He had married a young woman named Elena, the granddaughter of a ranching family from Taos, and they had 2 children already, a boy named William and a girl named Frances, who were the considerable delight of their grandparents. Franklin ran the ranch with the same systematic intelligence he had brought to his childhood study of accounts, and it was prospering. Clara, who was 29 in 1912, was not in Cimarron. She was in Albuquerque, where she was one of a small number of female physicians in the new state, having accomplished this through a combination of her mother's stubbornness and her father's patience, and her own extraordinary determination. She had gone east for her medical training in 1900 to the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania, and had come back to New Mexico in 1906, and had been practicing since then with a quiet diligence that was earning her a substantial reputation. She came home to Cimarron for Christmas and for the late summer weeks when the valley was at its best, and the household expanded joyfully around her on these occasions. Robert, who was 26 in 1912, was in Santa Fe, where he had been since 1904, painting. His talent had been real and had developed into something genuinely remarkable, and his work, which was primarily the landscapes of New Mexico, the light and the land and the particular quality of the sky in that country, was being collected and exhibited with a regularity that suggested a career rather than a hobby. He came home often and spent long days out on the land with his materials, and some of the best paintings he made were of the Cimarron Cross and its surroundings, the cottonwoods and the river, and the long view from the porch to the mountains. There was one of these paintings above the fireplace in the main room of the house, the view from the porch at sunset, the land in the long golden light with the mountains blue in the distance, and Louise looked at it every day and thought it was the most accurate picture she had ever seen of what this place was. On the night the statehood news came through, when the telegraph operator in Cimarron confirmed what had been expected, and the town made the kind of noise that towns make when something significant has been officially confirmed, Louise and Marshall sat on their porch with 2 glasses of the good brandy that Maria Castellano had taught them to keep on hand, and they looked out at their valley under a clear winter sky full of stars, and they drank to the new state and to the land and to the life they had built there. Maria Castellano was still alive, remarkably, somewhere in her 80s, still the most formidable person in the valley, and she sent a note the following day that said simply that it had taken long enough and that she hoped the new state's government would be wiser than the territories had been, which was a position that no one with any knowledge of history could argue with. Louise wrote back that she shared the hope and that she intended to make sure of it as far as one person could, which was the kind of thing she said because she meant it, and because she had always believed that one person could do more than they were generally given credit for if they were persistent and organized about it. She was 47 years old in 1912. She had been in New Mexico for 33 years. She had gray beginning at her temples and more knowledge in her hands and eyes than any amount of Cincinnati parlor education had given her, and she was still, completely and without reservation, exactly who she had been when she walked out of her uncle's house on a gray morning and refused to sign his paper and rode west. Marshall was 52, lean and weathered and as steady as the land they stood on, and he was watching her from across the porch with the particular expression she had always been able to read in him, the one that was simple and large and real, the one that said what he had said by the river in Cimarron all those years ago, which was that he felt it too, and which he had been saying in one form or another every day since. She crossed the porch and sat beside him close, in the way she always sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of someone who knows exactly where they belong. The stars were very bright over the Cimarron Valley, the way they always were in that clean, clear air, and the river made its constant sound below them, and somewhere in the dark the cattle were settled in the south pasture, and the house behind them held the warmth of 3 generations and 33 years of living and building and staying. Louise Rhodes, who was Louise McCrae, who had signed nothing and ridden west into the best life she could have imagined and several things she could not have imagined at all, held her husband's hand and looked out at her land and was content in the bone-deep and lasting way of a person who has built something true. The cottonwoods along the river moved in a light wind. The stars turned slowly overhead. The new state of New Mexico settled into its first night of official existence around them, and the Cimarron Cross settled into its 33rd year, and it was good.